In Florida's death chamber, Kayle Barrington Bates drew his last breath. It was a scorching summer afternoon in Florida's Panhandle, on a day that should have been ordinary. But in the quiet backwoods near Bay County, a suffocating silence was shattered by violence, so raw and sudden it would echo for decades. A man emerged, his shirt soaked in blood, his hands trembling. And just like that, justice, fate, and morality collided. This is the case of Kayle Barrington Bates, a story of obsession, brutality, flawed justice, and the inexorable march toward finality. This is True Crime Briefing. Stay with me, and together we'll walk through each chapter of this haunting case. Janet Renee White was a young woman full of life and hope. At just 24 years old, she had been married for 8 years to her husband, Randy White, a salesman with Maxwell House Coffee. Together, they built a home filled with laughter, shared traditions, and a love for the small things. Her friends called her Renee, and Randy described her as always smiling, always cheerful, and always dreaming of their next trip to New Orleans, which was her favorite place to visit. She was the kind of person who could light up an entire room with her warmth. Kayle Barrington Bates, on the other hand, was a very different story. Born in West Palm Beach, he once served in the Florida National Guard and worked as a delivery truck driver. He had made deliveries to the very state farm office where Renee worked. It is believed he became fixated on her during these deliveries. What seemed to others as routine visits may have quietly grown into an unhealthy obsession. Bates had a quiet demeanor, but behind that silence lurked a dangerous volatility. Their lives, though so different in direction and in meaning, would tragically intersect in a single day of violence. Renee was a young woman with her future ahead of her, while Bates was a man drifting further into darkness. The contrast of their paths highlights just how senseless and devastating what followed would become. This chapter of the story reminds us of the fragile lines between ordinary life and unimaginable tragedy. For Randy White, the memory of his wife is not just of that tragic day, but of all the days before, when love and happiness still filled their home. The day of the crime. It was Monday, June 14th, 1982, an ordinary summer day in Bay County, Florida. Janet had gone to work at the state farm office in Lynn Haven, where she was working alone. Earlier that morning, Bates had stopped by, striking up conversation as if everything were normal. No one could have imagined what he was truly planning. Around noon, Janet left the office to go home for lunch. It was her daily routine. She joined her husband Randy for a simple meal, sitting on the couch with him, watching her favorite soap opera, Days of Our Lives. It was an ordinary moment that tragically would become one of their last together. After lunch, Randy followed her back toward work. He watched as she turned into the parking lot of the office. He noticed nothing unusual and drove on, not knowing danger was already waiting inside. During her lunch break, Bates had returned. He had parked his pickup truck behind nearby buildings to stay out of sight, and then broke into the insurance office. He waited silently inside for Janet to return. Around 1 o'clock, Janet unlocked the door and stepped inside. The phone rang almost instantly. It was your friend, Geraldine "Jerry" Gilchrist, calling. But within seconds, Jerry heard something terrifying over the phone. A piercing scream, crashing sounds, and then silence. Inside the office, Bates had attacked Janet. She fought desperately, struggling against him. He dragged her into the wooded area behind the office, where he attempted to sexually assault her before stabbing her multiple times. In those final moments, Janet fought to survive, but the violence overwhelmed her. Bates even stole her diamond ring before leaving her lifeless body among the trees. It was a crime of shocking brutality, and it unfolded in broad daylight, in a small community where neighbors could hardly believe such horror could occur. The arrest and investigation police responded quickly after Jerry's frantic call. They raced to the office and secured the area. The signs of a violent struggle were obvious inside. But what shocked them most was how quickly they located the suspect. As officers fanned out, they spotted a man emerging from the woods. His shirt and pants were covered in blood, his hands stained. It was Kayle Barrington Bates. In that moment, there was no doubt in the minds of officers that they had found the killer. Nearby, they found Janet's body. She bore around 30 wounds, contusions, abrasions, and stab marks. The evidence was horrifyingly clear. The violence she endured showed how fiercely she had resisted her attacker, and how determined Bates had been to overpower her. The arrest itself was straightforward. Bates was taken into custody right there at the scene. Investigators quickly pieced together what had happened. Physical evidence, including fibers, his knife case, and even biological traces, linked him directly to the crime. In a rare instance, the investigation was not a long and winding process. It was clear, immediate, and devastating. For the community, the news spread quickly. A young woman had been murdered in the middle of her workday. Her killer had been caught within minutes. It was as though evil had stepped out of the shadows in the most ordinary of places. Trial and sentencing. The trial began in January of 1983, only months after the crime. Bates faced charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and attempted sexual battery. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with precision. They showed how Bates had stalked, ambushed, and murdered Janet White. The jury did not deliberate long. The evidence was overwhelming. Bates was convicted on all counts. When it came time for sentencing, his defense pleaded for mercy. His father even spoke on his behalf. But the jury recommended death, and the judge agreed. In 1983, Kayle Barrington Bates was sentenced to die in Florida's electric chair. This, however, was not the end of the legal battle. For decades, his sentence would be challenged. Appeals courts overturned his death sentence multiple times, ordering new hearings. But each time, Bates was resentenced to death. The case dragged on year after year, but the outcome never changed. The crime had been too brutal, the evidence too strong. For Janet's family, these endless delays stretched the pain of loss across 4 long decades. What should have been closure became a seemingly endless wait. Justice moved forward, but never quickly enough. Decades of appeals. Over the years, Bates's attorneys filed every type of appeal possible. Some argued ineffective counsel. Others raised questions about jury selection. One motion even sought to question a juror believed to have been related to the victim's family, but the court denied it as untimely. In the late 1980s, a governor signed Bates's first death warrant. Yet, the execution was stayed, and the legal process continued. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, motions were filed in both state and federal courts. Each was denied. Bates remained on death row, watching as decades passed. By the 2020s, appeals turned toward broader challenges. Arguments of racial bias in Florida's death penalty system. In July 2025, his lawyers filed a civil rights lawsuit, claiming that the governor's office disproportionately signed death warrants against black defendants, particularly those convicted of killing white victims. On August 1st, 2025, the 11th Circuit Court denied his request for a stay of execution. On August 3rd, a federal judge dismissed the civil rights lawsuit, leaving his defense with fewer options. On August 8th, his lawyers filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court, hoping for intervention. By August 13th, the Florida Supreme Court also rejected his final motions. Each appeal came one after another, each denied in turn. By mid-August 2025, Bates stood with almost no legal options left. The execution date drew closer, like an hourglass finally running out. Earlier today, August 19th, 2025, the clock ticks steadily toward the appointed hour. Kayle Barrington Bates sits on Florida's death row, awaiting the scheduled execution time at 6 this evening. It is the 10th execution in Florida this year, making 2025 the state's deadliest year for executions in the modern era. At 65 years old, Bates has spent 42 years under a death sentence, longer than many Floridians have been alive. His lawyers continued to plead for clemency, citing his military service and the racial disparities of Florida's system until the last hour, but those efforts have fallen flat. Veterans groups and faith leaders have joined the call, yet the governor had shown no sign of granting mercy. For the White family, the wait for closure has lasted decades. The murder of Janet Renee White remains as raw and painful as it was in 1982. For them, this moment represents the end of a legal marathon and the closing of a wound that never fully healed. As the sun set on August 19th, 2025, at Florida State Prison, the life of Kayle Barrington Bates ended at 6:17 p.m., following a 3-drug lethal injection. He offered no final words, declined a final meal, and requested no spiritual advisor in his final hours. He had spent that day awake early, surrounded by a few family members, his daughter, his sister, and his brother-in-law, who visited him one last time, according to reports. For Janet Renee White, the loving wife taken too soon, this day brought a legal conclusion to 4 decades of pain. For her husband, Randy, and their family, it was a final closing, not of grief, but of a relentless chapter that would never truly end. This is more than a story of crime and capital punishment. It's a somber reflection on justice, mercy, and the enduring scars of tragedy. This has been True Crime Briefing. Please, if this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to stay with us as we bear witness, one tragic case at a time.